This is Richard Wolff responding to a member of our Patreon community, Teresa Uffner, who asks about the minimum wage and particularly points to the fact that there are huge classes of workers here in the United States that do not get coverage under the existing federal and often also state minimum wage laws, particularly in fields like farming and agriculture, in restaurants, and in prisons, where there is a particularly horrendous refusal to pay minimum wage. She asked basically why that exists and what might be done about it. This is a very good and important question, and I appreciate that Teresa used the AskProfWolff facility on our websites and so on to ask it. So let me respond in a basically brief way because in this case that's possible. The only reason exemptions exist for those industries and for those situations is that the employers in question, the owners of farms, the corporate farms, the corporations that own restaurants, and so on, as well as the corporations that work with our prisons to impose unspeakably low wages on incarcerated people. As if being in prison wasn't punishment enough, you are also enabled to work at criminally low wages. Anyway, the only reason those things exist is that those employers were able to get the support of politicians that they donate to, I'm being polite here, so that the laws that were passed exempted those industries, exempted those work situations, allowing people to be paid less. The complaint of the employers was always, if you have to pay a minimum wage that's higher than what we now get away with, we will go out of business. In other words, it's a threat. If you make us pay more, we will fire those people so that the real choice for these poor people is either low wages or no wages at all. This is like a hostage saying you can choose between whatever I'm about to do to you or I'll kill you. And therefore people choose whatever they're about to do to them because it's better than the alternative. By the way, all the industries that are subjected to the minimum wage, which we have had since it was first passed in the 1930s here in the United States, all of the employers who fought bitterly in the years earlier to not have a minimum wage, the same employers who have fought against raising the minimum wage over the intervening years, even as the prices of goods and services went up. If you adjust the minimum wage for the prices people have to pay, the minimum wage is lower today than it was when it was first passed in the 1930s. That's because prices have risen since then more than the wage was adjusted upward. So in a sense, the employers have won. For a long time, they prevented any minimum wage, and since it was passed, they have been in general quite successful, particularly in the last decade or so, in blocking any increase, even as what they produced as employers, they sold for ever higher prices. So the answer, of course, is simple. Number one, extend the minimum wage to everyone, in or out of prison, working on a farm, and working in a restaurant. You know, the tip you give a waitress or a waiter is supposed to be a recognition of the extra they have done in serving you with a good spirit, with a good mood, making the dinner you eat or the lunch you eat a more pleasurable, a more useful experience because of the human interaction. They ought to be paid for the work, bringing the food to the table, etc. But they also are allowed to be and should be paid extra for the tip. The way the minimum wage is denied to restaurant employees in particular is by allowing the employer to lower the minimum wage from $7.25, the federal minimum, all the way down to $2 or $3, with the difference being the tip. That was a crazy argument, but it worked. It got politicians to go along, which they wanted to do anyway, and screw the restaurant workers already among the lower paid in our society. So pass a law guaranteeing it to everybody. And number two, index the law to the cost of living. That is already done in our society. For example, the Social Security system automatically adjusts what is paid to people over 65, etc., if prices go up. The exact same indexing could and should be done to the minimum wage. It's the least we could do to people at the low end of the income scale. And the whining and complaining of employers will make no bigger difference in this area than it did in all the other areas where the bill was opposed by the employers, where finally it was passed anyway, and where the employers find ways to cope. You know, the same thing was said about child labor, that employers should be free to hire children as young as 5 and 6 years old. The first century or two of American history was full of that. And when finally people said, no, we want our children to be in school and not being abused at work, the employers whined and complained, oh, then we'll go out of business. Oh, we're helping families by bringing in a little bit more money through having their kids work. They wanted their underpayment of children, their abuse of children, to be rewarded as social behavior. The outrage here has no limits. It didn't work to stop the abolition of child labor, and it shouldn't work to stop the abolition of underpaying people now exempted from the minimum wage. So thank you, Teresa Uffner, for your question. And this is Richard Wolff for the Ask Prof Wolff service we gladly provide to our Patreon community.